Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We have Frances here who will be guiding us through a virtual cooking class. So we're very excited to host a CSA Ideas Lab that's a little bit different than our previous webinars. I'm Sadie, the network coordinator for the CSA Innovation Network, and we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're doing a virtual cooking class today, so we're going to go over a CSA share and hear about some fun recipe ideas. I'll quick start us out with an introduction to the CSA Innovation Network, and then I will hand things over to Frances, who leads Cooking with Our CSA, an online blog and CSA and food community. So we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end if you have any questions for Frances or for us about the CSA Innovation Network. But glad to have you here. And as a reminder, we are recording today's presentation, so you'll have a chance to share this out with friends, family, other CSA members after the fact, and we'll also be sending out recipes and other support materials after today's virtual cooking class. So to kick us off, the CSA Innovation Network is a national community of technical assistance providers who are all embedded into the farming community and focused on community-supported agriculture, along with consumers and farmers all connected to CSA. We work as a group to build awareness of CSA and also to provide support materials for farmers to be more successful with community-supported agriculture structures and for consumers to be able to benefit from CSA. So Frances has been a great partner in the Innovation Network with helping us share about how people can be successful CSA members. And we're so excited to have her here to share some recipes with us. So here's just a quick highlight about Cooking with Our CSA, dedicated to sharing recipes and tips that highlight the seasonality of produce from CSA farms. At this time, I'll go ahead and hand things over to you, Frances. And just a reminder, folks, you can feel free to add anything in the chat throughout today's webinar. We'd love to chat with you, and we'll have a chance after Frances is done walking us through the cooking segment of this event today to do some Q&A with the crowd. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sadie. And hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you today. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon here on the Sunday on the West Coast. And I just picked up my CSA box earlier this morning and had everything laid out. Our time together today is going to be split into 2 predominant segments. The first is talking through a little bit about what it's like as a CSA member to pick up the box, bring the box home, lay out everything, and start coming up with a game plan for making our meals throughout the week. For context, this box here is feeding our family of 4. We have 2 small kiddos, my husband and I, and just kind of working through making sure that nothing goes to waste in this box this week. The other kind of highlights to note from after we go through the kind of unboxing and think aloud about what I might make with our meals this week is then to do a kind of a cooking demo. And it's a bit tricky when Sadie and I were talking about kind of like a virtual cooking class and thinking about how to kind of structure the time. The beauty of joining a farm CSA is that we have the seasonality of the ingredients before us, and there's a level of adaptability where not every single recipe, given very specific ingredients, is going to fit the bill depending on what we get in the box. And so I do have a seasonal recipe that I'm going to share with you today. The recipe card is going to go out in the follow-up email that Sadie will happily send that has a recording and then additional resources. So if you wanted to make this specific recipe that we'll work on today, that will come your way, no worries. And at least today we'll talk through some of the key tips around the specific seasonal recipe that we can actually use year-round. And so first up, talking through what we got this week. And it's kind of an interesting week too, because we're also in the process of moving. So my family and I are getting ready to move next weekend. Very excited, but also it's very busy. And in the spirit of wanting to keep going with our CSA, a big thank you to Phil at Sage Mountain Farm and the team for just sponsoring our box this week and making sure that we had some delicious fantastic produce to get us through our final week here in Southern California. And so tonight we have, let's see, a number of potatoes here. And the first thing, like the kids were asking for burgers. We have turkey burgers in the freezer. So I'm going to do some roasted potato wedges with this whole batch of potatoes here today and roast them in an oven, garlic, some herbs. I have some parsley left in the fridge from the garden. I did a last garden harvest. So we'll do some garlic and parsley on the potato wedges with a turkey burger. And then we're going to use some of our seasonal recipe. It's a pesto later this afternoon. That's also going to go onto the burgers as well. So that's been exciting to see. I have kale here. And if you have followed along on Instagram, where I'm mostly at in terms of social media, I'll talk a little bit about when we get seasonal greens. So I have a bunch of kale here. You can use them for salads. You can, and in doing so, I personally love like kind of marinating them a little bit to soften the leaves with a little lemon juice and olive oil that helps to tenderize the leaves. Perfect for a salad. If we're not going to do that, which I'm leaning towards, we're probably not going to do that this week. I'm going to clean my leaves, remove the stems, compost them, put this in a freezer bag, and this is going to go into the week's smoothies. So that's kind of also a wonderful way to get additional veggies into my little one who will only eat her greens if they're blended into a smoothie. So that's our game plan for the kale this week. We have red leaf lettuce here that I'm going to make a DIY salad mix along with the carrot tops that are right here in front. And so carrot tops kind of get a bad rap where oftentimes, and I've heard this even at the farmer's market, folks will ask to have these removed. These are completely edible as well. They're great in either a chimichurri or a pesto, or in this case, I'm going to add them to just a salad mix with our red leaf lettuce here this week to make sure that these get used. The kids will love snacking on the carrots. They're the perfect size for like lunchtime snacks. So that's kind of what we'll do with this. We've got apples and donut peaches. So that stone fruit season is in play and they're absolutely delicious. And we have a bit of zucchini. And so zucchini is that one where we tend to get a good chunk of it this time of year, whether you're growing it in your garden or you're getting them at the CSA box or you're finding them at the farmer's market. I have a couple of options and I have my notes here. One, tomorrow night we'll probably do a veggie lasagna. So this one's a pretty good size. I will saute this up with a little bit of the tomato and some of this broccolini here. And then a little bit of some spinach that I have in the freezer. Nice like veggie heavy lasagna because I also have some pasta noodles that we need to use. So that will be kind of on our game plan. For the remainder bits of squash, then we're going to make a pesto with one of them today. So I'll show you how we do that. And then the second is going to be either some like veggie style tacos or enchiladas. And the final one, I think I'm going to use for a shaved zucchini on pizza for Saturday night with some ricotta and some garlic. We've had pizza picnic at our house every Saturday for about 4 years now. And that'll be our last Saturday in our house before the big move. So I feel like that's a really great way to kind of end our time here in the season. So got a game plan for all the zucchini this week. For our tomatoes, I mean, they're just gorgeous. They're beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I'm thinking some sandwiches tonight, topping our burgers with a few slices. I've got turkey bacon, so we'll make some turkey BLT, and I've got some burrata. So I just need to go pick up some really good bread. We'll use some of that pesto that we're going to talk about this week, and that's going to be delicious. I do have a few beets here for some lunchtime salads. So some of the meal prep that's going to happen today is a pesto that I'll show you shortly. I'm going to roast these beets really fast for lunchtime salads. I have some protein that we've cooked up. We'll use that with our greens here. And then we do have about 4 cucumbers. So some of the initial ideas, one quick pickle, like a refrigerator style pickle. I have a recipe on the blog for that. And then that's going to go on our burgers. Otherwise, it's also just really great in cucumber salads, and then some cucumber water with mint that we also have from the garden. Another great way to just use up all of the produce here. The last bits here, we've got avocado for guacamole, woo-hoo, my favorite. And then I'll quick pickle some radishes as well for breakfast tacos, dinner time tacos, and crunchy texture for salads. And so that's kind of what I'm seeing here. There's lots of different, I think, when it comes to seeing something like this, there's like the analogy I always loved is puzzle pieces or Legos. My kids are really into Legos right now. So it's always just going, we see all these pieces. What are the meals that we can bring together? For the tomatoes, for instance, you can roast them, make it into a sauce. You can saute them. You can dice them raw, add them to a salad. But that's really the beauty of why our farm CSAs and why, as much as we can, as best as we can, supporting our local farms, especially when they have a CSA, gives us just that consistent produce week to week. So I'm going to go ahead so that's our game plan here, kind of a few of those ideas for dinner. Every Sunday, most Sundays, I'm sharing this also in a blog post. So if you're following along or subscribing to my weekly newsletter, then you'll also kind of get an overview of what are we thinking for dinners this week? How are we making use of the produce in the best ways that we can? With that, I'm going to pause my camera here and mute my audio to move to the kitchen, where we'll now go ahead and start making some delicious pesto. And then in the meantime, if you have questions in the chat, you can pop them in there and then we'll take a quick peek.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that intro to your box, Frances. I am going to just pop up the quick introduction to you so people can see, your picture again as you move over to the kitchen, and a snippet more about cooking with our CSA. So feel free to go follow Frances on Instagram or go to her website. And then just like she had mentioned, cooking with a CSA is like assembling a puzzle. So that's exactly what we're going to do today, is look at what Frances's CSA items were and how it works into a pesto recipe. And then she already talked about all those other recipes that she's looking forward to making throughout the rest of this week with their CSA box before moving. And then Frances, we did already get one question in the chat, which is about how to freeze those greens without getting freezer burn so that they stay nice and fresh and not turn sour or rancid or anything for smoothies and using later.
So I've got the laptop here with our questions as well, or like being able to see that. So my eye gaze here on the camera phone. Hello, everyone. And then on the computer here. And so let's see. Recommending greens while avoiding freezer burn. Okay, so when it comes to the greens, one with the kale, for instance, I'll make sure to chop off the stems, add those to a compost bin, or if you have a composter, add them to that, or the greens waste bin. If you don't have that, that's fine. And then I will wash and make sure that I pat them dry with a clean linen kitchen towel. You want to remove excess moisture while making sure your greens are clean. This will help prevent any kind of water crystals or from the excess moisture that might freeze and lead to freezer burn. And then making sure that you're storing the greens in a freezer safe bag. I like to use stasher bags, or like they're silicone, non-plastic. You can use your gallon Ziploc bags as well. You just want to make sure that that seal is airtight so that you're not getting any air into the bag that can promote those like water crystals forming or icicles that lead to the freezer burn. When freezing greens, I tend to employ a rule of trying to make sure that we're using them within 3 months' time. It's relatively easy to do when we're just kind of taking constant inventory of the freezer and like, oh, I've got kale in the freezer. I want to make sure I'm using those in the smoothies this week, or even adding them as a saute to like a veggie plate as a side. You can freeze your leaves whole. You can also give them a rough chop if you want to do that, so that you're already kind of doing some of the prep work ahead of time. So I'm hoping that the answer to that question is helpful. And then let me see. Yeah, you're welcome. And Amanda, I love the suggestion. I do the same. So even with like the kale stems, I won't be doing this week. I normally will do this in previous weeks, saving them in a freezer bag as well, and then holding on to your scraps, your onion peels, your kale stems, parsley stems, and then save all of those bits and bobs for fresh veggie stock or If you have poultry bones, adding it in to make a poultry stock too. That's always a fantastic idea. All right, so today we're going to make a pesto. Pesto is one of my favorite things to make year-round because it's versatile, it's easy. We can use a good chunk of all of the produce that we have before us as much as we can. And with this particular one, they're also really freezer friendly. I'll show you a couple of tips, and I'll talk through a couple of tips of when making batches of pesto, all the different uses for it, and then ways to freeze it optimally so that you have it also in winter, because that's kind of what happened to us last summer. We were making batches and batches of pesto, freezing it, and then enjoying it in December. So it's great. So this particular pesto is zucchini basil pesto. What I'm going to do first is shred the zucchini. I'm going to start with this one because zucchini, as many of us probably know from cooking with it, does carry a good chunk of moisture content. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is shred it so that we can process it in the food processor. You can also use a blender, but we're also going to remove the moisture. And so what I'm going to do here is just cut it in half, my little scrap bowl. And then I'm going to go ahead and process. It. So with that one done, add those scraps there. It's important to remove the moisture from what we've shredded. So I'm going to put this in the sink and I'm going to grab a kitchen towel. Okay. So I've got my bowl, clean linen towel. You could use paper towels if you like. And the first part I'm going to do, it gives us about 2 cups. So depending on the size of the zucchini that you're using, you want good medium-sized zucchini that will get you about 2 cups worth. That's going to be helpful because we'll couple that with our seasonal greens, which we're going to use basil. So I'm going to take my towel and then start to remove. So you can start to hopefully see that, like just liquid dripping from the towel. We want to remove that because otherwise we're going to have soggy pesto. Nobody wants soggy pesto. So we want luscious, creamy, delicious pesto. So once we've removed all of the liquid, I'll put the zucchini back in the food processor. And then we'll get ready to add the rest of our ingredients. We don't have to go too hard on squeezing out all of the liquid, but just as much as you feel like, okay, I got it, we're good. So then take it out. It's also worth noting, I did, before cutting it and putting it in the food processor, I just gave it a quick rinse and then wiped off any excess debris, any extra dirt or whatnot. Sometimes it happens, you just want to make sure that that's all done. All right, so we have about 2 cups here. I'm going to go ahead and replace, I've probably done that earlier, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and add our chopping blade to the food processor. And then the next things we can start to add for the rest of our ingredients. I'm going to add in 2 to 3 cloves of garlic. Garlic lovers, feel free, if you want to use more, you totally can. And I'm starting with 2 to 3 here. One helpful cooking tip. So I'm deciding to use slivered almonds. Classic pestos will use pine nuts. Feel free to use the nuts that you prefer. I'm using slivered almonds today. I do have pine nuts. You can also use toasted walnuts, and you could also use almonds, like whole almonds or slivered almonds. You could also use seeds if you like as well. So you want the ratio to be about 1/4 cup of nuts or seeds that you're using for your pesto. So today we're using slivered almonds. That's going to go in here. The next is I've washed and quickly dried basil. My basil leaves. I picked these up at the farmer's market today to go with the pesto. I feel like the flavor profiles between zucchini, which has kind of this mild and slightly sweet profile, with the basil is just really complementary for a summertime pesto. We're gonna have 2 cups of packed basil leaves here. And then I'm going to add in my salt, kosher salt and black pepper. I've measured out a half a teaspoon of each. So that's gonna go in here. And I think we're ready to rock and roll. Yes. So I do have cheese that we will add, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. I'm not going to process the cheese first because if you're using a food processor, the heat of the blade can tend to melt the cheese more quickly than I would like it to personally. So I always save it for the end to fold it into the pesto after we've processed the greens, the garlic, and the nuts. So now we're going to go ahead and give this a pulse, rough pulse before we add in the oil. Okay. Got one little leaf that got stuck. We do one of them. All right. So we've got kind of a coarse chop here. I think we can kind of see that. There we go. Yeah. So we got a coarse chop here. I'm gonna put this back on, and now removing the top portion of my food processor, processing it on while slowly adding in the oil in a steady stream. Then you'll start to see at the bottom of the base of the food processor, our pesto really starting to form. Okay. So given that a good process here, I'm going to scrape the sides momentarily, but you can see just smooth. It's looking really great. I'll give it one more process just so that I can scrape the sides so that all the little nooks and crannies here are processed within the pesto. Okay. And then we're done. So here, kind of at a fork in the road, decision point, depending on what we want to do with the pesto, determines whether the cheese goes in or it does not. One, if we're going to use it today, for instance, for us, we're going to use this throughout the week. So the cheese is going to go in for sure today. If not, you can totally freeze this. Silicone ice cube trays like this one here, grab that real quick. So I like using this one in particular. This is from WP Design. I'll send out links to these as tools as well for folks who are interested. But silicone's great because it doesn't really stick. I keep one specifically on hand for pesto just because garlic and basil and all of the delicious things, the scent might stick from time to time. But it's also really easy to clean and easy to remove the cubes when I freeze it overnight and then place it in a bag. So the key tip when it comes to preparing pesto ahead of time is you don't want to add your cheese. It's not that you can't, because I believe that, in instances you probably could. However, texture, at least from my experience, when freezing something that has the dairy like Parmesan cheese, it can change the texture when you're defrosting your cubes of pesto. So at this stage, when I've processed my pesto and I know I'm going to save this for later, I just take this out and start portioning it out into the silicone ice cube tray, pop it in the freezer, freezes overnight, remove the cubes, put them in a freezer safe bag, label and date the day that you made it, and then just keep track of them over time. Each cube measures about a really generous tablespoon. And that's helpful if I'm wanting to, say, take out a couple of cubes to add to a pasta dish the next day, defrost them overnight in the fridge, and then they're ready to go for when you're ready to use them. And then if you are wanting to use your pesto today, like we will, then you add your, I totally spilled out that part. That's fine. You can add your pesto into the bowl and then add your cheese. So Parmesan or the cheese, I'm using Parmigiano Reggiano here. it's so flavorful and I don't want it to kind of like melt into the pesto. And especially if I'm going to add it to something like hot pasta or a sandwich, like if I'm making a pesto aioli tonight with a portion of this, that I don't want to mess with the texture of the cheese. It's aged beautifully. And all I'm going to do for any Schitt's Creek fans, we're going to fold in the cheese, like legit, just fold it in and you're ready to go. Taste and adjust your seasoning as you like. And it's making a generous cup in terms of what our end result is here. So ways that I use this, if I'm going to use this within a week, I'll make a pesto vinaigrette. So add in a little bit of some acidity, some lemon juice, some olive oil, and then you've got a pesto dressing for dinner salads. Add it to pizza as a sauce, some mayonnaise, or making a pesto aioli to add to sandwiches or burgers, in our case tonight. You can use this on a roasted fish like salmon or chicken. Possibilities are endless. But what I love about a recipe like this, and this leads into the ratio that I hold in my head when I'm making these, is a ratio of 1:8:2. That's 1 part, looking at my notes, 1 part nuts or seeds, 2 parts cheese, 8 parts greens, and then 2 parts oil. So in this instance, we're using a 1/4 cup of our toasted nuts. We have our 1/2 cup of grated Parmesan. We have 2 and 2 split between our 2 cups of grated zucchini that's been where the moisture has been removed, and our 2 cups of packed basil leaves, and then a 1/2 cup of our oil. So holding that ratio of 1 part, 2 parts, 8 parts, 2 parts gets us that ratio that is consistent in our pesto recipe each and every time. With that in mind, this one's great for summer. A classic pesto recipe with basil and your pine nuts, also great for summer. In winter, I like doing this with spinach and arugula. Carrot tops are great in pesto too. So it just really helps to highlight. You can make a sauce, adapt and swap out ingredients that meet the season at its peak, and have something on hand that you can use for all the meals of the week as you desire, and then freeze the rest for next time. So there's our pesto for today. Questions, comments? Oh, okay. I see here too. Are there any nuts you avoid for this? Oh, let's see. I don't think that there's any, Amanda, to your question about nuts that I personally avoid. I tend to rotate pretty heavily between walnuts, slivered almonds, and pine nuts. Pine nuts, especially as of now, when I've done some ingredient pricing, they're really expensive. So I opted for slivered almonds today, only because it has a similar like coloring and texture when you toast them versus say whole almonds. Whole almonds, I'll use them if I absolutely have to. They're probably not my favorite just because I'll get the skins in there in the pesto, and that can kind of change texture only mildly. So it's like if you're really paying attention to it, you might notice the difference. But those are the 3 that I tend to rotate through the most: walnuts, slivered almonds, pine nuts. You're welcome. Yeah, all right. Other questions as I'm gonna grab a glass jar here and then bottle this up.
Frances, I have a quick question about the different types of greens that you mentioned. Do you always try to have some herbs in the pesto, like basil, parsley, or any other herbs? Or have you done them where it's more of just like a green sauce if you have a ton of kale or spinach on hand? Or
I'll do
similar recipes maybe that you would use if you've got so many greens to mix up?
Yeah, if there are, so what's also kind of fun about like the recipes even on the blog, like this zucchini basil pesto, for instance, if you look on it there, well, this is speaking to the nuts specifically, but it calls for pine nuts. And today we're using slivered almonds. For the greens, I'll swap out like the spinach and arugula one. If I don't have herbs on hand, then it's just I'm heavy-handed with the arugula and the spinach. I might end up doing something where I might go heavier on garlic. And so that's where I feel like a recipe like this, the ratios are a really great starting point. And it's also a guideline where if you like garlic, one, you're probably one of some of my favorite people, and don't be afraid to use it. If you want more cheese, you can add it. Being mindful about texture. So you like the consistency that we're trying to achieve here is that smooth sauce. So if you don't have the herbs, depending on the seasonal greens that you have, I wouldn't sweat it unless you absolutely want to have it. I have in winter, like I'm trying to think about when it comes to winter, and I think I tend to lean more heavily on the greens that we have on hand. Done kale, like kale and spinach as a swap out for something like that, and that's worked pretty well. The key here is just that ratio, right? So you want, like if it's 4 cups of your greens, wash them, give them a rough chop, pack it down, and then that should work pretty well. Other questions? Wonderings, even if it's just outside of pesto, just kind of thinking back to the produce that we were looking at earlier. We kind of do a quick cleanup.
Yeah, I was curious as we're talking through other uses for greens and sauces. Do you have a chimichurri recipe on your website, or do you want to just like quickly give folks an idea of chimichurri sauce? Because I feel like that's sort of in the same family.
Yeah, that one, I don't put it in the food processor, but I'm pulling it up. I'm going to pull it up here. And that one's just like a lot of chopping from what I've made. That one I've made with carrot tops. So like I was even kind of kicking around the idea of doing that. And oh, I don't think I have it on here yet. That's probably one I need to get on here. But I've done that with carrot tops. Let me go into my notes here because I do have it in my notes portion. So like a chimichurri with the carrot tops, for instance. I've made that with mint and the carrot tops and parsley. Yeah, so it's like parsley, mint, some of the carrot tops, lemon, some fresh lemon juice. So like the lemons we have here would be great. Garlic cloves. I'm using about 6 in that one in particular. And red pepper flakes, good quality, extra virgin olive oil, and some kosher salt. So that kind of like thinking about herbs that you might have on hand. If I'm wanting to do something with the carrot tops, especially, that one's been top of mind lately because it's one I think a number of people have questions about of how do I make sure that those don't go to waste. And chimichurri is a really good one, along with pesto for them. I might make some pasta. It's like 2:30 here, so dinner is still a bit of ways away for us. But if you were game, you could definitely get some pasta ready until al dente. Add in a couple tablespoons of pesto, and you're good. You're good to go. Yeah. Any other
Yeah, so
questions?
you mentioned, so you'll be using it for pasta tonight probably, or later this week, and then on a sandwich spread. You mentioned aioli or mayonnaise. Any other things that pesto could go into for us to note down and share with people?
Yeah, I might. So as I'm looking at my jar here, so you could tell like that whole bit of pesto that we made is fitting this. I think this is like a 12-ounce jelly jar. And so tonight we'll do the burgers with the roast potato wedges. It could probably even add it as like a dip for the potatoes. That'll be really good too. I'll make a salad dressing. I might add this with some, like for the veggie lasagna tomorrow, I don't have any ricotta. So I might go to the grocery store and pick up ricotta. So this kind of is a throwback to our earlier sessions together. So for folks who've joined for part 1 and part 2, talking about the unboxing of produce beforehand and looking at, okay, what are some of the things that I'm going to make? If it's veggie lasagna for tomorrow night, for instance, I might want to go pick up some ricotta at the store because I don't have it. I'll whip some of that ricotta with this pesto to do a sauce to then layer in between the sauteed veggies that we'll end up cooking. And then that's just a nice way to make sure this gets used and also get to enjoy all of those veggies as well. So that's one way, that's another way that I'll probably use the pesto. The other is probably on fish this week. I have some salmon that I need to cook up. So I might do some like salmon in parchment paper and then add a dollop of the pesto post cook. When it comes to, and this is a tip I'm immediately thinking about, I tend to prefer adding the pesto post cook just because basil as an herb is really not sensitive. I have to think of the right adjective for basil. Basil can be like does not like the heat. I get that. So it's like basil's like, I don't like the heat. So if I'll roast the salmon, for instance, in a 350-degree oven for about 20 minutes, just until it's nice and flaky and cooked through, and then I'll add the dollop of pesto right on top. So it kind of melds into the fish. It'll flavor the fish and it'll be really yummy. And then have that with just another side of veggies, probably some sauteed zucchini, for instance, and the broccolini. That'll probably be really nice. So that's like another way I might use the pesto, because my goal now is I've made it. I got to use it this week before we leave. So yeah.
Yeah, having it on top of fish sounds really tasty. That's making me think of how lemon would probably go with that really nicely. Do you typically add something with acid like lemon or vinegar to the things that the pesto is being paired with? I know I've just seen some other recipes where like lemon juice or something is added directly into it, but what's your preference on getting that acidity incorporated?
Yeah, I like the zest in adding that as an additional kind of flavoring component. I like to add that especially in the after of the, so if I'm doing that with fish, for instance, like going back to the fish, you could add some lemon slices to the fish and parchment. And that's a nice way to get some of the acidity in there before adding the pesto, especially because you have this kind of the richness between the cheese and the oil in the pesto that can that's complemented nicely with especially with lemon. So those are some of the ways that I might incorporate that. With say the aioli, I might add in some white wine vinegar to a little bit of the mayo and the pesto to get some of that acidity. You could also use lemon juice as well, just depending on flavor profiles and what you want to use or what you have on hand. So like if this was last week and I didn't have lemons, I'd probably go with some white wine vinegar to get that acidic component into whatever I'm going to make.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Does anybody else have questions for Frances about the pesto specifically or anything else around her meal planning, unboxing the CSA, and looking at what it's going to turn into throughout the week, recipe development, anything like that? I'm not seeing any questions come in at the moment, but folks, feel free to toss anything in the chat or feel free to unmute, turn your camera on if you want to, or raise your hand, whatever works if you have any more questions. Frances, were there any other notes that you were planning to share or anything else we wanted to talk through before we wrap up here?
I'm thinking through, we've talked about freezing pesto, tips for optimally doing that. We've talked about adjustments like the ratio formula for adapting your ingredients. So depending on the seasonal greens that you have on hand, we've talked about our just that process of unboxing is always a fun one. I feel like it's the one where for us as for CSA members, myself included, is always one that is a constant practice of what do I have in front of me, shopping what I already have. So like this morning, I already took stock of freezer and pantry to get a sense of what needs to get used before the end of the week. And then thinking through one of the other tips that I had shared around shopping after the fact. So for instance, right, if I'm thinking, oh, I want to make a lasagna, do I have everything? Is there anything else that I need to supplement to make sure that I have it for when I'm ready to make it later in the week? And those are always just those prime practices that I feel like have been helpful in especially the 4 years that we've subscribed to the Sage Mountain Farm CSA. And I know that they're practices that we're going to take with us to the next CSA that we end up subscribing to. So that's kind of on my list of to-dos this week of like finding the next farm CSA. It really highlights how incredible and it's rewarding and gratifying when we know where we're sourcing our food, how that food is grown, the level of love, care, and attention that farmers put into cultivating the very food that's feeding our communities, and then coming up with all the different ways to enjoy those ingredients, that recipes can be both that strict script and also an adaptable guideline. And so if I know, okay, if I'm using X amount of ingredients to make a pesto, I can swap and substitute as I move through each season so that I have a consistent recipe in my back pocket so that I'm always making something delicious that also has multiple uses for whatever I want to do. And I think when it comes to cooking through the seasons, those are just the foundational practices that I've personally come to lean on and are ones that I'm consistently wanting to share with readers and audience members and fellow friends and family. So I'm just really thankful that we got to share that time together today. I'm hopeful that this is helpful in just thinking through something that maybe a lot of us know. It's like, it's pesto, it's classic, get it. But then thinking about like, how do we maximize it in ways that just help us along in our very busy days.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad we had to got to share this time together. And I think you did have a lot of wonderful tips on just making that perfect pesto, making it nice and smooth, folding in the cheese afterwards. I know I've definitely had the cheese get it gummy before when I try to start with that in the food processor. So that was a great tip along with your ratio of 1:8:2. That's really catchy. Nice to remember.
Yes, thank you. And if questions along the way, feel free to email me or you can DM me on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram, mostly on Threads, most social media platforms. You can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter Dinner Plans. I'm sharing our weekly plans, featured recipes, tips for cooking with the seasons, all the good stuff. So you can find me there and just don't hesitate to reach out for questions or feedback along the way.
Wonderful. I'll go ahead and share just a couple of quick slides to wrap us up. And if anybody does have questions for Frances, still feel free to put them in the chat over the next couple of minutes. Again, it's wonderful to put together the puzzle of pesto today with the lovely basil and zucchini and some different options for nuts and cheeses. We'll be sharing out the recipe. I just typed up this quick 1:8:2 template for the ratios that Frances shared, along with some of the pesto ideas for what you can then do with a few tablespoons from the big batch that you make. So we'll share all of this afterwards, along with links to the previous slides from parts 1 and 2 of this series with Cooking with Our CSA. For instance, this is a very, very quick recap. Frances already talked through this, but planning the meals after you unbox your CSA for the week, asking about ingredients that you're not familiar with, so farmers know what they're growing. They're happy to share that with you. And then shopping at the grocery store or market after you've got your CSA in hand. So all of that good stuff we will share over email and also link out on our social media for the CSA Innovation Network. If you do have any more questions for Frances, these are the ways that she said you can contact her: Instagram, website, email, and then I've also got the CSA Innovation Network's website listed here too. So you can feel free to peruse all of the resources and recordings like this one and others on our website, along with our Instagram and YouTube channel are available too. So thanks everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you again, Frances. This has been great to work with you this summer. Good luck with your move and hope your family enjoys that pesto during the rest of this week. Thanks
Thank
all.